there's a nice bit when there is a bit where you taste water that the water is so clean and pure. You talk about civilization. It's something about civilization is still in the future. But that water that you're drinking from, where was it? Because it wasn't in the wild, was it? It was under a bridge.
Oh, it was coming out of it. Yeah, I mean, it was coming out of a mountainside. And, you know, Pennsylvania is not wilderness. I mean, there's woods and there's wild tracts, but there's towns everywhere and there's railroads. And, you know, this was a spring or a creek that was coming down off a mountainside. And, you know, I say that it tasted like civilization was still something in the future. You know, sometimes we had a filter pump, and, you know, sometimes we would pump water that was suspect to us. Once we drank water out of the Youghiogheny River that runs through an industrial area of Western Pennsylvania, and we even filtered it. And one of the guys still got so sick he was thrown up for a week. So, you know, we drank some bad water out there, but you know, it didn't kill us.
Well, anybody that's listening to this because they're a traveler will enjoy it, but it does not come in a conventional travelogue package. You do not take a journey from A to Z and give us a map at the beginning of the book. The very opposite, because what you're doing is thematically exploring notions of freedom. And there's a really big question at the heart of your quest, which, what do you think of the traits and the behaviors that allow human beings to be free from the oppression of other people? What did this journey tell you about that?
Yeah, so it was our mobility and our smallness that allowed us to avoid detection and to avoid being arrested and to maintain our autonomy. And when I talk about freedom in my book, I mean, there's 1,000 conversations you can have about freedom, legitimate ones, important ones. But for my purposes in this book, I'm really talking about a very ancient sort of human value of being of remaining self-defining and uncontrolled by a greater power, right? And for most of human history, that meant that your community, that your survival group, your people, were able to defend themselves or evade a more powerful enemy that would kill you or enslave you. And, you know, and history is just littered with examples of powerful tribes and powerful nations that enslaved and killed their neighbors. And, you know, that's just humans, right? I mean, that's the human species. It's very, very violent. And I talk about the Yamnaya in 5,000 years ago that traveled in all male groups. They fought on the backs of horse-drawn chariots before horses were widely used. They fought with battle axes, and they were basically the first motorcycle gang, right? And they like carved their way through Europe and invaded the Iberian Peninsula, and within 100 years, they killed all of the men in Iberia and clearly mated with the women, right? And so the Neolithic Iberians had a radical loss of freedom because they couldn't defend themselves. So my book is divided into 3 sections: run, fight, and think. And basically, if you can't outrun your oppressor, the way the Apache did in the American Southwest for hundreds of years, almost until 1900. If you can't outrun your oppressor, you're going to have to outfight them. Outfight them like the Montenegrins did, outnumbered 12-1 by the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans came in to create a vassal state in Montenegro, and these wild mountain people just handed them their hat. I mean, they were outnumbered 12-1, and they decimated the Ottoman army, right? And if you can't outfight them, you're going to have to outthink them. And that's where some of these amazing social justice movements sort of come into view. The labor movement 100 years ago in the United States, the Easter Rising in Ireland that eventually threw off British authority, English authority in Ireland. They sort of lost the initial battle in Dublin in 1916, but they won the war. And that was in large part because of this very sophisticated political chess game that they were playing against the British authorities, and the labor movement in the United States as well. It was a brilliant chess game that they played, and eventually they won against incredible odds.
This idea and the way you structured the book, Sebastian, which was run, fight, think, and it's sort of a 3-part structure. It was really quite interesting to me because when I first picked it up, I thought of a book that I love, or certainly the attempt of a book that I love, which was The Anatomy of Restlessness by Bruce Chatwin, who struggled hugely about covering a topic that, why do men wander rather than sit still? It's not taking it quite to the depth that you explore freedom, but it's the beginnings of a similar idea that was too big to cope with for him. It was too big. And I was wondering if you ever found this topic almost too big to write about. And with that in mind, because I can see the result, how long it took you to getting to that sort of very economic structure that you finally have put around the book?
I was so terrified of how big the topic of freedom was that I wrote a very short book. I mean, honestly, I don't mean to be flip, but I realized that if I didn't have an extremely sharp focus, I would still be writing 700 pages in. I'd still be sort of plodding away through this, like, basically bottomless topic. I mean, freedom, it's this enduring human value. It's one of the few things people will die for. They'll die to defend their community, their people. They'll die to protect their children, and they'll die for freedom, right? And there's not too much else that people will die for. And so it's an endless topic. And it's sort of infinitely complex. I interviewed a guy who'd done 30 years in prison, and he was released for good behavior. And I asked him, if it was possible to be more free in prison than outside of prison. He said, yeah, of course it is. He said, you can't be a drug addict in prison. That's one of the main forms of, I don't think he said the word enslavement, but it's appropriate word. So one of the main forms of enslavement is drug addiction, is addiction to anything, right? Of servitude, maybe is a better word. He said, there's no distractions in prison. You don't have an iPhone, you don't have a television, none of that stuff. You got nothing but time. And eventually in prison, you will eventually have an honest conversation with yourself about who you really are. Then you're a free person. And often that can only happen in prison. So I realized the possibility of writing a book that was way too long. So I thought, I want to write something completely original on this amazing topic that so many brilliant people have weighed in on. But what do I have to say that hasn't really been said before? And I chose to, as a former anthropologist, I chose to look at freedom sort of anthropologically. Like, what is it that has allowed people on sort of underdog groups to win fights, contests over larger, more powerful groups throughout human history? And I boiled it down to run, fight, and think. And that, I wanted to be very, very reality based in this, like not too conceptual, not too theoretical. I should say about the wonderful Bruce Chatwin, he wrote an amazing book called Songlines, and that I read, in my 20s or something. And I remember him talking about, maybe I should have acknowledged this in my book, but I remember him talking about the effect of walking on human babies and how the cadence of the human walk very, very quickly quiets babies. And we're clearly adapted to move on foot. And if you just look at what babies respond to in terms of being placated and calmed. And I mentioned that in my book, and and that thought goes all the way back 30 plus years to me reading Bruce Chatwin.
Well, I'm a huge fan of his work as well, and I think it was, what am I doing here? Restlessness, Songlines. You're approaching it from quite an American place as well. That was very interesting to me. One, I think your voice belongs with those American greats, Cormac McCarthy, Hemingway, and all the rest. But also, actually, this is a walk through the American landscape, and for a Brit, that did something for me as a reader to understand these nuances of how the American Indian history works and all the rest of it. But I would like you to talk a little bit about this idea of freedom and the underdog being the winner, because there's one particular section that I had to really think through, which was the boxing ring and how that really works. I was like, surely the little guy can't win. Can you explain that? Because that was a bit of anthropology that I felt, well, not anthropology, but a bit of deep dive that took me somewhere I wasn't expecting.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what's so interesting for me when I realized, and I'm a boxer, and I came to that a little later in life as well. It's an incredible art. It's an incredible sport. And one of the really interesting things to me is that we're really the only mammalian species where a smaller individual can outfight a larger individual. I mean, usually, with elk and grizzly bear and walruses and mice and everything else, the sort of largest alpha male wins every physical contest until they age out of their dominance position and get pushed out by another large male. And of course, they maintain these physical rivalries for access to females. I mean, it's a very common part of many mammalian species, and size really does determine outcome, but not in humans. And so I really looked at the sort of biomechanics of that. So it turns out that if you are in a fight and you throw a punch, it takes quite a lot of energy to throw even one punch, right? And it takes very little energy to what's called slip a punch. So you sort of tilt your head and the punch goes by your head. It's very easy to do this. It's very hard to do this. And if you do that 10 times in a row, the attacker is winded. And so large, being big and having big muscles, if you're in a fight in an elevator, that would clearly carry the day. But if you're in a larger area where you can move around, the smaller fighter really has a significant asset, which is that they can remain free with less energy expenditure than the larger guy can try to dominate with. And after a few minutes, once you're deep in oxygen debt, you really don't function very well, right? And that's true at every scale. That's true in the boxing ring, and it's true in an insurgency. I mean, the Taliban fought to a standstill the three great empires, right, of recent centuries, right? The Brits, the Russians, and then the Americans, right? It wasn't the Taliban back with the Brits, of course, but I mean the indigenous warring forces of Afghanistan. You were able to defeat these amazing empires, right? It's because they were light, they moved fast, they weren't sort of heavily burdened by armament, and they just outlasted these three empires, much like a smaller fighter can outlast a larger fighter until the big guy is just sort of like sucking air with his hands on his knees and he can't stand up because he's too winded.
It takes us back to some of the story about the Apaches that you cover. They're moving quickly and invisibly, and this idea of when you have little, you maybe are freer. You move differently through a landscape. And there's one, again, a phrase I loved, which was I think, is this the translation of Apache? Dew trampler. Is that right?
Yeah, yes. So leaders, right? In the Apache people, the leaders were called dew tramplers because leaders were expected to literally lead, right? And they would conduct these raids against enemies, and these raids always happened at dawn. And the first man in line was the leader, right? And he wasn't in the back hiding from the arrows and bullets. He was in the front. He was the first person to get. He would be the first person to get hit, and he was called the dew trampler because passing through the underbrush at 4 a.m. When the leaves are heavy with dew, he would brush the dew off of the images that everyone who followed him would be going through, foliage that had already been like shed of its dew because the leader had already passed. And one of the things, I look at sort of commonalities to successful underdog groups, and one of the things they have in common is that their leadership is literally or metaphorically ready to die for the cause, that they are running the same risks and experiencing the same consequences as the people that they lead. And one of the, I think, tragedies of sort of modern society is that people who are enormously powerful, presidents, generals, heads of corporations, are often actually sheltered from the consequences of their decisions rather than insisting that they suffer along with everybody else. I looked at the leader of the Easter Rising, a man named Connolly, in Dublin, and he was the general Petraeus of the Irish of the Irish rebels in 1916, right, and the supreme military commander in Dublin. And his aides kept having to drag him out of the street where he would go out, he would wander off into gunfire to try to plan where to put the guns and the sandbags, and these aides were constantly like, "Sir, you're going to get shot. Please take cover," right? And he was shot twice. I mean, he was wounded twice. Now that's leadership. And as I say in the book, if as a leader, if you are protecting yourself from the consequences of your decisions, you're not actually a leader. You're an opportunist.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you're you're wise enough not to talk about certain leaders in your country or in mine, and about this idea of how real leadership is about sacrifice and about remembering the community, if you like. Do you want to just sort of develop that thought a little for us? Because I found that very compelling, and I loved the fact you didn't reference clearly the context that you were writing in, which was Trump's America.
Right. I mean, as soon as you, I mean, I'm happy to tell people that I'm a Democrat. I mean, you got to be something. I happen to be a Democrat, and I happen to be an atheist. I'm not religious. And, you know, I say that because there are many people who are conservative in this country who like my work. There are many people who are religious who like my work. And I want to force those people to either abandon my work or to change their ideas about Democrats and about atheists. You know, I mean, I'm in a good position to sort of get people to really think about, oh, maybe I'm wrong to categorize Democrats as enemies of America or what have you. And Democrats are just as bad with Republicans. So just to note that. But as soon as you start naming names, you start losing readers, you start losing listeners, because it's so partisan right now in America. And you know, these are the principles that I'm writing about are enduring and eternal. And you don't need to name, you know, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or whoever. Like it, we all know, you know, like we talk about these values, you know, the courage of real leadership. We talk about that. You talk about them that in honest terms, and everybody knows how our leaders measure up to that standard. You don't need to name the names. The readers can do that work for themselves. And so that's why I feel like journalists should be absolutely nonpartisan. And as a very, very wonderfully smart friend of mine said, journalists don't tell people what to think. They tell people what to think about. And as soon as you name names, you're telling people what to think. And I don't want to do that.
Again, it's something that I think it gives it a kind of universality at the same time as speaking to the specifics of my time right now, where I am sitting, and in a time of COVID, when of course human freedom is being challenged and in other ways. Did you feel because this also, we should talk about this. This was also a film. Or was it a film? Because the same journey has come out in two very different ways. The Last Patrol. Do you want to just talk about the Last Patrol being a film made in 2014? I think it was. It was aired, which is you and your friends walking the railroad, and that almost posits a different question and comes up with a different experience for the viewer, as definitely this book, which was also the journey on the railroad. And how does that, how did you manage to make two things out of the same journey? When did one form after the other?
So originally I took this trek with 2 or 3 other friends. As I said, we'd all been in a lot of combat, and I brought a videographer who quickly became, you know, he had never been in combat, but he quickly became completely part of the group and a brother and everything. And he documented, he's an amazing videographer, and he documented part of this trek. And then after the shooting was done, you know, it happened over the course of a year, there were still sections that I wanted to walk. And so we kept going out there. Some different groupings of us kept going out there and pushing westwards along these railroad lines. And so the Last Patrol, as it was called, was a film that I was the director of it, that came out with HBO in I think it was 2014. I think you're right, 14, maybe 15. But then we kept going. I mean, I kept walking, and I kept keeping my notebooks, and I kept thinking about this. And much later, a couple of years ago, I thought, oh, I think I'm going to write about freedom. Is it possible to write a short original book about freedom, and what would that look like? And I asked myself, what was the freest you've ever been? And I came up with this trek. Like that, in some ways, that was the freest I've ever been. No one knew where we were. We were making all of our decisions unforced by any hand, you know, and so I thought, oh, maybe I'll intertwine a narrative about this like strange act of vagrancy that we committed, intertwine it with a more anthropological and historical look at how freedom has been maintained throughout human history. And am I a good enough writer? The question for me was, am I a good enough writer to weld together, to blend together these two completely different topics in a way that seems seamless and not jarring, that seemed natural and even obvious to the reader. That was the challenge for me as a writer.